if there were evolutionary circumstances under which ADHD is actually a distinct advantage? One recent paper has found an example of this, and we're going to look into it today. Hello and welcome to The Noise Coaching. My name is Lee and I'm a leadership coach specialised in growing the careers of mid to senior neurospices. This video is a follow-up on last week where I looked at some papers around ADHD and evolution. I initially intended to release it all as one video, but my ADHD can't really sit through a YouTube video longer than about 10 minutes, and so I thought it best to actually split this video into two parts. So if you haven't seen it already, go back and watch that first half now, and then this is part 2 for all of you that can't sit through long videos like me. But in order to motivate this week's video, I'm going to pick up on some of the context from last week, just so we laid the foundation. Last week we looked at the paper, Empirical Tests of Natural Selection-Based Evolutionary Accounts of ADHD, a Systematic Review. I'm not going to rehash the paper again, it's a bit of an interesting one and I go into it in a previous video, but the conclusion they come to is that all of these evolutionary theories around ADHD are a little bit inconclusive at this point. There's no real evidence to support them, but there's no real evidence to disprove them either. It's all just a little bit up in the air. What is most interesting about this paper though is actually the quote that they put at the end, because they suggest a next area of study which is really interesting. The quote says, "It could be possible to test individuals displaying various degrees of ADHD behaviour under circumstances mimicking key features of an ancestral environment, rapidly changing, time-critical and resource-depleted. If the environmental mismatch hypothesis suggested by Jensen et al. Is correct, individuals with ADHD should outperform individuals without such traits under these circumstances." So guess what? We're going to look at a paper about rapidly changing, time-critical and resource-depleting environments. This paper is called Attention Deficits Linked with Proclivity to Explore While Foraging. And I'm going to pass you over to Parsley to tell you a little bit more about this. So take it away, Parsley. Tell us what's going on. Now this paper is super recent, published actually in Feb of this year, so really recent. And it looks at patch foraging. It's where you must make a decision to stick with a known resource that is potentially depleting or move to a different patch and forage there. The exercise I used also had a time limit, so we start to hit 2 out of the 3 scenarios listed in that quote above. The theory suggests that these patch foraging decisions can be solved in an optimal way by algorithms such as the marginal value theorem. These algorithms are actually well tested with birds, bees, monkeys and humans, all shown to follow these kind of algorithms. It also matches up with other human behaviour. The Achi hunters of Paraguay have been shown to work in this way, as well as the Nahua mushroom foragers. And even just human shopping, apparently. The paper suggests that evolution has come up with a near optimal way to solve this problem of patch depletion when foraging. The purpose of this paper was to investigate how ADHDers behave when compared to the general population on this such decision-making exercise. They lay out their predictions early on. Ready? "We predict that individuals with ADHD or ADHD-like phenotypes will both leave patches earlier than predicted by foraging models like the MVT, and also earlier than individuals lacking in the phenotypical characteristics." I'm foreshadowing a little bit here, but I wanted to highlight this again. So the paper predicts that ADHDers will leave the patches earlier than predicted by the optimal foraging model. Earlier. Instead, they found that everyone stayed longer than the marginal value theorem projected. Everyone. But the ADHDers didn't stay as long. And also the people with high ADHD self-report scores actually scored higher overall on the game than people who didn't. They still stayed longer than as predicted by the marginal value theorem, but they didn't stay as long as non-ADHDers. I'll just highlight this again. The paper predicted that they'd find that ADHDers move on far earlier than is optimal as predicted by the marginal value theorem. And the implication is that non-ADHDers would be there for roughly the right time. And what they found was that everyone stayed far longer, but the ADHDers behaved in a way that was more optimal than the non-ADHDers. When I read these papers as part of my research, there's often clearly identifiable bias in the papers. And I talked about this when I was talking about ADHD and personality in that video, where one paper described ADHD as low functioning, whereas another paper looked at ADHDers who were mostly college educated. And those two aren't equivalent, but they do show the biases that these papers come from. And so in this particular case, we came into a bias of ADHD are going to perform worse, and actually found that we perform better, which is actually really cool, because it's grating to hear that people with ADHD are worse over and over again in my research. But I digress. Let's get back to the topic. They did suggest some limitations on the studies. The first is that the people were not officially diagnosed with ADHD, or not necessarily officially diagnosed, and they used the ADHD self-report questionnaire in order to group people into the two sections. I don't really know how I feel about this. I feel like the ADHD diagnostic criteria is a bit incomplete anyway and doesn't reflect the full experience of having ADHD, so I don't really feel too strongly either way on this, but it is important to acknowledge for an academic paper. The second point was that this experiment was run during the pandemic, where there was a global increase in ADHD-like symptoms, and as a result, almost half of the participants in the study actually scored as being ADHD-like. I actually found this comment really interesting because it reads in a way that suggests that ADHD symptoms were present more among the neurotypical population, but that's actually not what it's saying. I went and looked at the reference, and the reference says that ADHD symptoms in children were actually more apparent during the pandemic. They became more exaggerated during the pandemic, but it doesn't say anything about ADHD-like symptoms in neurotypicals. It actually occurred to me that the fact that almost half the participants had ADHD was more a sign of the times than anything else, because if you think about it, we're in the middle of the pandemic, the whole world has stopped, we're not allowed outside our houses anymore, we have to stop all our hobbies, all we have to do is stay at home and work if you have a job, or do what you can at home if you don't have a job. People with ADHD were probably bored and therefore looking for dopamine, and doing an experiment for research is something interesting and something different to do during your day. And it wouldn't surprise me if that was part of the reason why they had so many ADHD participants. I know I took part in the Great British Intelligence Test twice because it was during the pandemic, I needed the variety, and they sent me follow-up emails asking if I wanted to do it again, and why not? It's something new. Even with these two limitations in mind, the paper concludes that ADHD has an adaptive specialisation to foraging, and that might explain its prevalence and its persistence in society. Brought into the context of the modern day society though, a lot of our decision making isn't like this. It's actually more like non-depleting, alternative choices kind of decision making, and just like mentioned in the first paper, that's not what we evolved to do, that's not what we're adapted to. So ADHD could be considered maladaptive to our current way of life. And speaking of struggling model day society, I do coaching for mid to senior neurospices in their career to help them move through their career in a way that works with their brain. If that's something that is interesting to you, I always have a link to my website in the description, so have a look around and get in contact. That is it for today's video. Give me a like, comment and subscribe. And if you're interested, you might want to go back and watch my previous video on how to make ADHD work in your career.